Well, welcome everybody to the Developing Web Apps with Zojo webinar. I'm Geoff Perlman. I'm founder and CEO of Zojo, and I'm here with Ricardo Cruz, who's our web framework engineer.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining.
Okay, so if you have questions, there's a question and answer panel in Zoom. It's at the bottom in the toolbar. Please put your questions in there. Ricardo may answer some of them during the seminar, but we're going to save most of the questions for the end. We've got a lot of stuff to cover. So let's get started. First, what are we going to cover in this webinar? Well, we're going to talk about how web development is the same as desktop and mobile development, and of course, how it's different. We'll be looking at layouts, specifically web pages, web-only controls, synchronous versus asynchronous apps, web sessions, which is something unique to web apps, latency, something also unique to web apps, handling simultaneous users, deployment issues, security, which is of utmost importance in a web app, and Zojo Cloud. All right, let's dive in. So how is web development the same as desktop and mobile development? Well, it is mostly the same. You've got a default web page. Just like in a mobile app, you have a default screen, and in a desktop app, you have a default window. So in a web app, you have a default web page. The layout editor pretty much works the same way. Drag and drop, double click on controls to select events, add code. That's all pretty much the same. Just like desktop and mobile, you have an app class, and the app class can have methods and properties and such that you add. And that information, those class members are global, so they're accessible by all of the different users in the web app. It's for the most part event-driven, just like desktop and mobile. And many of those events are common and shared. For example, there's opening and closing events, there's pressed events. You'll find that a lot of the events that you're used to using for desktop and mobile development exist for web apps as well. And most of the other APIs are the same or similar for adding rows to list boxes and responding to the user, typing text into a text field, that sort of thing. A lot of them are the same where they can be. Now, there are going to be some that are unique, and we'll talk about some that are that don't exist for the web. But on the whole, they're very, very similar or the same. And any non-UI code that you write for application logic and classes and modules, that can be shared between your desktop, mobile, and web apps. So I mentioned that the UI stuff cannot be shared, or I kind of implied it, but that's not completely true. Here's a method that I wrote for an application. It's called bind entry control. And you can see what I've done is I've overloaded the signature. So the first parameter of the first signature takes a desktop UI control. The second one takes a web UI control. So I'm actually writing code for desktop and web in the same class. And then what I do is in the advanced pane of the inspector for the desktop, for the first signature, I set it to only be included in desktop apps. And for the web signature, the second one over on the right, you can see I have it set to only be included in web apps. So you actually can create classes that deal with UI and are useful and can be used across multiple project types. And this is just a quick example of that. Now let's talk about layouts. This is a big one. Layout dimensions are, for the most part, not within your control. What do I mean by that? When you build a desktop app, you create a window, and you can decide if that window is going to be resizable, how big it can be, how small it can be. You have a lot of control, but that's not the case with a web app. Now, when you're laying out a web page, it may feel in the web editor, which is being shown here, it may feel like it's pretty much the same as a desktop app, but it really isn't. Once this layout is displayed, it's going to be displayed in the client or the user's browser window, and you have no idea how big that window is. For example, if I lay out these controls like this, and then I run the project, by default, it's going to look like this. It's going to put the layout in the upper left corner. Obviously, the window is quite large. That's really not ideal for such a small number of controls. Now, you can try using locking that helps. Here's an example of using locking with that same set of controls. Still really not ideal. So in cases where you have a small number of controls like this, and you don't want to have them expand to take up the whole screen, there is a way to constrain them, and that's using a web container. So the web framework has container controls just like desktop and mobile. So you add a web container to your project, lay out your controls the size you want in that container, then you drag that container onto your layout, and voila, it's constrained to that size, and you can actually make it so that it sits right in the middle, right in the center of the browser, using control locking, which I'll talk a little more about in a bit. But this is a solution. This is also great for like login screens, because a login screen's often just a username and password, and you want it right in the center of the screen. So using the container control, and again, I'll talk more about the locking in a bit, but you can get the effect that you want. Now, having said that, when you're designing web pages, you really need to think about the fact that the user's browser window is probably going to be pretty big. And the best thing you can do is take that into consideration when you're designing your user interface. You know, you may be used to designing it differently from mobile, definitely, because the screens are generally so small. And for the desktop where you have multiple windows, well, you don't, that's not the case here. So you need to consider the space available and maybe design your layouts a little differently than you would for desktop or mobile. That's what we did for the Eddie's Electronics example. You know, we have a list box over on the left where the user can select a record, and the edit areas around it. You can see, you know, other list boxes for invoices, a map, etc. So we're really utilizing all the space on the screen. If you want to see this example live, you can go to eddieselectronics.com, and that'll bring this example right up. But this is a good example of really utilizing all the screen space. Now, there are fewer events in web apps. Just as a couple of examples, text fields do not have key up and key down events. The canvas control does not have mouse up, mouse down, mouse drag events. There is a pressed event, so you can still react to the user clicking the mouse on a canvas, but it doesn't have the events you'd need for things like dragging. Now, why is that? Why are these kind of events missing? Well, basically, there can be potentially thousands of miles between the server and the user's browser, and having all of that traffic going back and forth is not going to be a good user experience. There's just too many problems with that. So that's why there's fewer events. There are more control locking options, though, and let's take a look at those. So you're used to using the control locking features in the inspector, but you always have at least one control, or one lock rather, turned on. Well, in the web, you can actually turn off, say, the top and bottom, or the left and right. You don't have to have one on each side selected. When you turn them off, for example, top and bottom, it's automatically going to center that control in the middle of the browser vertically. And if you do left and right, horizontally in the browser. This is how I achieved that layout I showed you, where I've got a container control with a bunch of controls, and it is now centered right in the middle of the browser. You just turn off all of the locks, and the object will be constrained to the center of the browser. So you got more control locking options with layouts. Now, there are some considerations when it comes to mobile. If your web application is going to be accessible to mobile users, and boy, that's just about everyone these days, you have to think about how the layout is going to work there. You either have to design your layouts so that they're friendly both for the desktop browser and the mobile browser, assuming you're going to support both, or the other option is to have a second set of layouts that are smaller and designed specifically for use in a mobile browser. That's what we did with the Eddie's Electronics example. This is what it looks like when you access it in a browser on a mobile device. These are separate layouts, different from the ones for the desktop. The first one shows a list of customers. You tap on a customer and it switches to the second one, which shows the detail. So that's another consideration. And, these days that's pretty common. Again, people are so used to accessing web applications from their mobile phones. It's a good idea if you've got a complex UI to make a separate set of layouts specifically for mobile. Now, another thing to consider is that web apps are not desktop apps. Web apps have been around long enough now that end users expect a web app to look and feel differently from a desktop app. So it's a mistake to try to make a desktop or make a web app rather look like a desktop app. That's not to say you don't lay out the controls in a logical fashion. That's of course, what you would do, but you don't try to make it look like it and work like a desktop app. Web apps are different. Now, you may find yourself needing to match the look and feel of a website. That's understandable. And in that case, there's a technology that Zojo uses, that the web framework specifically uses, called Bootstrap. And this is what does all the theming. This is what draws the controls and makes them look the way they do. And there's a built-in theme, but you can go download your own themes from bootswatch.com. It's got thousands of open source free themes. You can preview them on the website. You can go and download them. This is the website, and you can even modify and customize the themes there. So you can find one that matches the website you're trying to match, and then or closely matches it, and then just tweak it a bit right from the website to make it match the website that your app needs to match. Now, right now we use version 4. So when you go to Bootswatch, make sure you go to bootswatch.com/4. That will take you to the Bootstrap version 4 themes. They are working on Bootstrap 5, but we can't support Bootstrap 5 yet. There's still some work that the Bootstrap team needs to do. Once we announce that we're supporting Bootstrap 5, then you can just go to the regular main website and use the themes there. So that's that. Once you download a theme, and the way you like it, you just drop it into your project, and your project will start using that theme. Now, there are some controls that are unique to the web. First is the breadcrumb control. The breadcrumb control is basically a navigation control. I think it's really useful if you have a fairly large complex entry system or just multiple pages for showing information, and you want to give the user a way to navigate between them without having them to remember to use back and forward. You can show a path to the page you're on. Like in this case, we've got a customer's screen that takes you to maybe a shipping page that then takes you to an address page, and the user can click on the parts of this control to navigate between those different areas. So the breadcrumb control is really useful for that. We've got a file uploader control. This is exactly what you think it is. You can drag a file, or the user can drag a file into this area and to upload it. They can also click the select button here and get an open file dialog box where they can pick a file. Now, this doesn't upload the files as soon as you drop them in. It's up to you to call the controls upload method. But this gives you a user interface that the user can use to select files. We also have a link control, and this is pretty much what you'd expect. It's essentially like a label, except for you can add a URL to it, and then it becomes a clickable link, and the links can go anywhere that a link can go. And we have a map viewer control. Now, the map viewer uses Google Maps, and you'll need to get a Google Maps API key from Google. You can go to their website, just search for Google Maps API key, and it'll take you right to the page you need to go to. You can get one of those for free. They give you a whole lot of free map views per month. For most web apps, it's probably plenty. If you go over that amount, then they'll start charging you, but the rates are pretty reasonable. You can find all of that out at Google's website. Now, there are some web controls that are different than their desktop equivalents. The list box. If you're used to drawing the cells in a list box, or if you need to, it's a little different. Instead of using events, you use the web list box cell renderer class. So you want to take a look at that. The canvas, as I mentioned, canvases have fewer events. You have a pressed event, but you don't have the dragging events. Text field, same thing as I mentioned earlier, fewer events. You do have text changed event and lost focus and received focus. So you pretty much have the ones you'll need there, but there are fewer events. The HTML viewer for the web can load HTML directly into the control. You don't need to send it to a URL or load an HTML file. You can pass HTML directly to the control, so that can be handy. Web threads, this is your, like a regular thread, but they're session specific. We'll talk more about sessions in a bit. And web timer is also session specific. It can fire the event from the browser or the server, though in both cases, the timer executes on the server. The key thing with web timers is, and to some degree web threads, is you don't want anything executing too rapid fire, because remember, everything executes on the server. So the more a timer is firing, for example, the more traffic is going to be, the more busy your web application is going to be on the server. And the busier it is, the fewer other users it can handle and the less responsive it will be. So you have to think about that when it comes to development. And in the web framework, we have device location, just as we do in the mobile framework. Now, let's talk about synchronous versus asynchronous. So the desktop is, basically synchronous. I mean, it's asynchronous to a degree in that it's event-driven. But for example, when you display a modal dialog in a desktop app, your code pretty much stops at that point and waits for the user to finish in the dialog and then continues. But a web app is pretty much asynchronous. And this is especially important when it comes to dialogues. In the web framework, there's a class called a web dialog. It's a project item. You can add it right into your project. And the way this works is you design your dialog just like you normally would, drag and drop and all that. And then for the page where you want to call that dialog, you drag it onto that page, and it becomes an object on that page. And that then has a dismissed event. The web dialog instance will have a dismissed event that gets called when you call the dialog's close or hide methods. So in that sense, it's more event-driven than it would be compared to a desktop app, and that means you've got to take that into account in terms of how you design your apps. Now, if you have more than one way of closing the dialog, let's say you've got OK and cancel buttons, then typically what you do is you add a property to your web dialog, and the goal of that property is to determine which button, or to store which button was clicked to close the dialog. So what you do is, let's say you've got OK and cancel. In the OK button, you set this property maybe as simply as to the string OK, and with a cancel button would set it to cancel. Then in the dismissed event of your web dialog, you can just look at that property and see if it says OK or cancel, and that would tell you which way the user exited the dialog box. You can then take appropriate action. But because of the asynchronous nature of web apps, it is going to take a little bit of thinking in terms of design, especially when it comes to things like web dialogues. So your logic may need to be just a little bit different than you're used to in a desktop or a mobile app. Okay, let's talk about sessions. So sessions are something unique to web apps. There's a session class, and in fact, what's actually web session class, and there's a session object that appears right in your project. Now, it's easy to think of sessions as being per user, but they really are one per tab per browser. So a user could, in theory, enter your app twice, one in one tab of a browser and one in another. So you just got to keep that in mind. It's not necessarily one session per user. There are ways to prevent that if you really need to. You could keep track of, the logins and things like that to prevent users from accessing the app more than once in a browser. But just keep in mind that a session is one per tab per browser. This is a great place to store information about the user, or specifically about the session. because it's an object that already exists. It's easy to get to. And you can add your own properties and methods to it right in the navigator. If you have information you need to share, data you need to share, then you want to use global objects for that. So you can create a module, you can put them in the app class, that sort of thing. Anything that's global will be shared between sessions. So if you need to communicate information between sessions, for example, that's a good place to store it, as in a global object. If you want the user to be able to navigate with the forward and backward buttons in their browser, then you'll want to take a look at the save state method of web session. This gives you an opportunity to save the information that's on the page, and then when the user comes back, you can repopulate the page with that information. So take a look at the save state method if you want to do that. And pictures, if you load a picture, they're session specific by default. Pictures in web apps the class is called web picture, and they have a session property. And again, that session property will have the session object for that session by default, but you can set it to nil. You can set that property to nil if you need to share a picture you're loading between different sessions. And hashtags, if you want the user to be able to bookmark a place in your web app, then in the preparing session event of the session class, you can add a hashtag, and then you can respond to that hashtag if the user goes back to the URL that includes it. This is a great way to let them, let's say you've got an inventory application, for example, and they want to be able to bookmark a part in your inventory rather than have to search for it every time. That's using hashtags, and session.preparing session event is a great way to do that. If you want to see an example of this, look at the Eddie's Electronics web example, because it uses hashtags. Every time you click on a customer in the list, the hashtag is added to the end of the URL with the customer ID, and you can then bookmark them. So you can try that out yourself, and you can go ahead and look at the code to see how it's implemented. All right, next we're going to talk about latency. So latency is a result of the distance between the server and the browser. Now, if you're building a web application that's going to be deployed on a server in your office, all your users are in the office on the network, latency is probably not going to be an issue for you. But that's not most web apps. Most web apps are deployed in the cloud. There could be thousands and thousands of miles between the browser and the server, and there are hops that packets have to take and all that. So latency can definitely be an issue. It's something that you need to be considering to avoid poor performance, and we'll talk more about this. Now, one area that is very efficient is layout delivery. When the user goes to a web page in your app, your Zojo app, the framework specifically, delivers this tiny little packet of information that describes the layout. It doesn't send all of the HTML from the server to the browser. It's this tiny little, very efficient packet that goes to the browser, and then our framework browser side opens that packet, and that packet has all the information that the browser, JavaScript and such needs to construct the page client side and display it. So layout delivery is actually pretty efficient. Now, if you want to simulate slower performance, Chrome is really good for this. On the developer menu, if you look for network, you can set it to a slower level of performance if you want to see what it's like. Because when you're developing on your own machine, it's going to feel really fast, but that's going to be different once it's on the internet and there's potentially 10,000 miles between the server and the browser. So it's a good idea to test using Chrome and the developer menu so that you can see what performance is going to be like in more real world conditions. And this leads to testing in general. The best thing you can do with a web app is test early and extensively with your users, especially if they're distributed over a wide area. This is different from mobile and from desktop because, generally speaking, the performance you're going to see on your own machine is going to be pretty close to what the user sees, generally speaking. But with web apps, that's not necessarily the case. So you definitely want to test parts of your app as early as you can in case you need to tweak it to get better performance. All right, now with a desktop app, of course, the user is the only user, and the same goes for a mobile app. But with web apps, a single instance of the app is going to be supporting lots of users. And the things that affect that are, of course, infrastructure. How CPU intensive is your app? If your app is very CPU intensive, of course, the CPU on your server is going to be busy doing that function, and that's less time it has to manage other users. So that's a factor that you need to consider. How much power the CPU has, how fast it is, how much memory you've got. Remember, this instance of your web app is serving all of the users that connect to it. So there's potentially a lot more memory that will be needed. So those are also factors in how many users an instance of your app can handle. This is another place where testing is really, really important. Get your users into your app, even if it's just for a few minutes, so that you can see how many of them the app can support based on the server you're planning to use. This isn't something where you can wait till the end. If you wait till the end, you may find yourself having to make major redesign because the performance isn't what you were expecting. So test early and often so that you can avoid that. This is also where load balancing can make a huge difference. Now, if you've got a lot of users, and what is a lot, there's a lot of factors that go into that, so I can't give you an exact number. But if you have a lot of users, then you may need to have multiple instances of your app running, and a load balancer helps manage that. So a load balancer is an application that will manage the traffic between different instances of your web app, and you may need, again, to run multiple instances in order to serve the entire number of users. This is much like in a retail location. You walk in, and if there's a lot of customers, what do you need? You need multiple people behind the cash registers to handle all those customers. It's the exact same thing with web apps. Okay, in terms of deployment, web apps are standalone apps. The web server is built into the app. Again, you may need to consider load balancing. Testing will help you determine that. If you're using a cloud provider to host your app, remember that these are web apps, not websites. The resources that a server needs for websites is quite small compared to an app. So when you're talking to a cloud provider, make sure that what you're getting is something designed for apps and not for websites. And web apps are basically console apps. So if you want to use them with Docker, you can do that. We have a blog post on our blog about using web apps with Docker. So if you just go to the Zojo blog and search for the word Docker, you'll find that project, or that blog post rather, and you can read up on it and see what's involved in deploying a web app via Docker. Now, if you're going to be doing load balancing and you need to share data outside of your project with multiple instances running for load balancing, then that information has to be stored in some global location, such as a database or in the file system itself. Pictures, for example, if you were going to be loading up pictures that weren't part of the project, you could have them in a folder on the server. And then, of course, that's global to all the instances that are on that server. Now, if your instances are going to be across multiple servers, obviously the file system is probably not the best place to do that. In that case, you're going to need something like a database. All right, next let's talk about security. Security is really important because the server is accessible to the internet. SSL, very important if there's any private information involved. Honestly, I don't think you should deploy a web app without SSL no matter what, because people are used to seeing it in their browser URLs, and they may be suspicious if they don't. So you're going to need to look into SSL for deploying your app. If you're doing logins, if you have an app that's logging into a database, something like that, where the user needs to log in to use the app, you do not want to store their password in your database, as plain text. Instead, what you do is when the user creates their account and they type in their password, you use a hashing function. We have some built into Zojo. MD5 is just one example. You pass the password to the hashing function, get the hash back, store the hash in your database. Then when the user goes to log on later on, and they type in their password in your login screen, you use that same function to get a hash, take the hash and compare that to the hash you stored in your database. If they match, then whatever the user just typed in, it matches what they typed in for a password when they created their account, but you're not storing the password. So if your database gets breached, you're not exposing their password to the hacker.
Yeah, we will be creating a blog post, a really long blog post about how to use hashes and how to handle user passwords in a secure way. So
Great.
we will be able to see it soon in the blog.
Excellent. That'll save you some time. So be on the lookout for that blog post once it appears, because I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great information there that'll save you a lot of time. Now, people that are malicious on the internet may try to cause you harm through what's called a SQL injection attack. And what this is the hacker puts actual SQL code into a field in your web app. And if you're not careful, that SQL code, like say a drop table command, can get sent to the server and executed. Fortunately, there's a really easy way to avoid this. Let's take a look. So here's a typical SQL select, right? We're selecting all of the columns from customers where last name equals, and we're appending the last name field's text property. Very common way to do it. But this is not how you want to do it in a web app, because what's going to get passed to the server is this entire string, all as one piece of information. If a hacker put a malicious SQL command into the text of that last name field, it could potentially get executed on your server and cause you a lot of grief. So don't do that. The way you do it instead is you use something called a prepared statement. And these are really easy to use. Here's an example of the same thing. Instead of concatenating the last name .text property, you put in a placeholder. You can see the question mark at the end of the SQL. That's a placeholder. Which symbol you use varies by database. You can look in our documentation to find out which one for the database that you're using, but most of them use question mark. So you put the question mark where you want the field, and then you pass the field notice as a separate parameter. And you can have as many parameters like this as you want using the same placeholder. You just need to pass each as a separate parameter in the same order that the placeholders appear. Now, the advantage to doing this is that the database server gets the SQL statement and then the values separately. It can then look at the values, see if they contain any SQL, and if they do, it will reject the SQL command. So it's a simple thing you can do to avoid a SQL injection attack. Next, make sure the data you receive is what you're expecting. You may want to do some filtering in fields that the user is typing in. There are things you can do, like if you want to only accept a number, you can use properties for text fields to only allow numbers to be entered. But the bottom line is make sure that the data is what you're expecting. If you have a unique application where you need the user to type in some URL or some HTML, or URL, something like that, just make sure that you're adding code to your application that examines that data and make sure it really is what you were expecting, because you're probably going to store it in a database, maybe display it again, that sort of thing. If your web app uses web services elsewhere on the internet, same as above. Don't assume that the data coming back is going to be exactly what the documentation for that web service says it's going to be. It may not be. So add a little bit of extra code to just examine what's coming back from the web service and make sure it's what you're expecting. And of course, with a web app, it's on a server. The server it has to be accessible to the internet, which means that the server has to be secure. So this is another area that you have to be aware of when it comes to deploying web apps. Now, let's talk about Zojo Cloud. So when we developed the web framework, we realized that making it easy to build a web app was really only half the battle. You know, with desktop apps, you build your app and there's lots of ways to deploy it. You can just send it to people and they can, download it and launch it on their computer. With mobile apps, you've got the app stores and things like that. But with web apps, they have to be on some publicly accessible server. And the deployment side of the equation is as big a problem as building the app itself. So Zojo Cloud was created to solve that problem. Essentially, what it does is makes deployment very easy, provides great security, and provides built-in load balancing, so you don't have to do that yourself. Now, what do I mean by easy deployment? It's one-click deployment. When you sign in to Zojo, you're signing in with your Zojo account. So when you get a Zojo Cloud web server, the IDE knows about your web server or servers if you have multiple. So you can just hit the deploy button in the toolbar and it deploys to your server, or pick one if you have more than one. But it makes it extremely simple for deploying an app right from the IDE. Postgres and MySQL are already installed. So if you're going to use a database server, then you can use one of those. They're already there. You don't have to install them. Zojo Cloud also provides statistics, so you can see things like CPU usage, memory usage, etc. If you have users complaining that your app is starting to get less responsive, you can look at the statistics and see whether or not it's just simply because you don't have enough memory or the CPU is using up, too much time. Maybe you need to get a bigger server, that kind of thing. For security, we have SSL built in. Click a checkbox, you've got SSL. It couldn't be simpler. And Zojo Cloud servers have several layers of security. They use security enhanced Linux. This was developed by the for the Department of Defense in the United States. Security enhanced Linux is a locked down version of Linux, is the best way to describe it. And it on its own is quite complex. I understand that the documentation for security enhanced Linux is something like 1,000 pages. Now, that would be really impractical for the average user because it's just going to be too complex. But all Zojo Cloud servers are identical, so we can deploy security enhanced Linux on our servers, and you get the benefit of the security without the hassle of having to understand security enhanced Linux, which is great. We have a custom-built firewall. Most firewalls are really just on-off switches for what ports are allowed through, traffic from different ports. That's not the case with our firewall. Our firewall actually examines the behavior of the user, and if that behavior starts to look like a hacker, it will block them. In fact, when we were building this, our own developers were getting blocked constantly because, as you can imagine, what they were doing during developing Zojo Cloud was looking like a hacker. So we know it works and works quite well. And we have other layers of security that we actually don't talk about publicly for obvious reasons. We don't want to tell hackers how to get around them. Now, sometimes you'll find if you have enough users that you really want, or just want another layer of security, you want something like your database server to be on its own server, not on the same server as your app. And we can handle that. You can put the database server or any other kind of server you want on a separate Zojo Cloud server. We can make it so that that server is inaccessible to the internet, and then provide an SSL tunnel, just as a secure tunnel between the server managing your app and the server that has your more sensitive data, like your database on it. We can set that up for you. That can be just a great way to provide you another level of security for the most sensitive information, and that's typically the information in your database. And we manage security updates for you. When you're deploying a web app onto a server, there's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of applications for managing data and running the OS and security, et cetera. And pretty much every month when new security updates come out, we install those for you. It's nothing you even have to think about. So that's another advantage of using Zojo Cloud, is simply the ability to have a very secure server that's maintained by somebody else. And Zojo Cloud has built-in load balancing. So if you find that your users are saying, "Hey, it's the app is getting a little slower," maybe you have more users than you were thinking you were going to have, you can go into Zojo Cloud and for a particular app and say, "Hey, let's fire up another instance of this with just a click of a mouse," which makes it really, really easy. And then if you need a bigger server at some point, you can upgrade your server to a larger server and have more instances of your app running to support more users. So that's what Zojo Cloud is: easy deployment, great security, and load balancing. All right, we are now at the questions part of the program. I'm going to bring up the panel here and let's take a look at some questions.
Thank you, Geoff. You've already covered a lot. I've been replying to some of the questions in the chat.
So I'm looking at the ones in open, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So a tutorial on SSL blog. Okay, so we're going to be adding one. Is that what you're saying there? That first question?
Yeah, Alvaro Fontan asked to create a blog post about deploying web apps on the Mac server, because we already have a blog post about deploying on Linux. But yeah, I will write down the question so we can create a blog post.
Okay, great. So yeah, so Sebastian was asking about a blog post in terms of deploying with SSL on a Mac, and Ricardo's going to look at writing a blog post for that. Okay. The next question is from Hanno. It says, and I apologize if I mispronounce any of your names. How many gigabytes are available for databases in each Zojo plan? Yeah, so you can look on the website and they're listed there. Each server generally has a bigger amount of storage. So just look, I haven't memorized the exact amounts. I don't have it right in front of me, but you can get that from our website. Clemens asked, will I get an alarm when a hacker has been identified? I don't believe we notify you when a hacker has been identified. Ricardo, do you have any more to say about that?
No, what we have is support. If you need any support or recover a database or something like that, then Jason will be able to help.
Yes, so we can help you should you be hacked, but we don't let you know when you are. We've talked about this. We might add something in the future because there is information that gets logged. It's just not in a place that you can easily get to it.
Mm-hmm. I mean, the servers on Zojo Cloud are very secure. They are using SC Linux and all this, but yeah, you will have to protect your application. Yeah.
Yes, and we've had billions and billions of attempts, by the way, on Zojo Cloud deployed apps. So you're not going to avoid it. I mean, hackers are going to try to use your server. It's uncommon that they're attacking you directly. It's typically that they want to use your server to send spam, for a denial of service attack. It's that sort of thing. And that's bad too, because not only does it mean you're, contributing to that, but more importantly, that's using up memory, CPU time, resources on your server. And of course, you don't want that happening. So that's why we put so much security on our servers. In fact, we have shown our security to cloud providers, and they're just stunned by how much security we have. I mean, we're really locked down very, very tightly. So Kevin's asking, is there a deep dive on the topic of synchronicity? Because I don't get it and don't even understand Edward's question. Maybe Edward's question got answered earlier. Well, it's not as complicated as it might seem. Basically, I think if what you're asking is the asynchronous versus synchronous nature of a desktop app, for example, or a mobile app versus a web app. Mostly, not entirely, but mostly it comes into play with dialogues, because in a desktop or a mobile app, you're used to throwing up a dialogue, calling show modal, and your code stops at that point and waits for the dialogue to go away. But as I explained earlier, when you deploy, or when when you show a web dialogue, the web dialogue itself can be modal. The user won't be able to avoid, they won't be able to switch to the web page. The dialogue is modal, but you show the dialogue, and then the code that showed it is just going to continue on if there is anything else for it to do. The user then, obviously at some point, something is going to close or hide the dialogue. And at that point, the dialogue's dismissed event will be called. So you're used to the code executing one line at a time all the way through your process, but now it's going to be broken up into events. Essentially, whatever initially brought up the dialogue, and then the dismissed event of the dialogue itself. My suggestion is just make a quick little web project and experiment with a dialogue. We probably have an example in the example projects of a web dialogue. And I think if you just kind of follow through with the debugger, it'll become obvious. It's one of those things that's easier to see than to hear about. So Tim has a question. Do you have plans to release somewhat lower spec for cloud options? We don't at this time. Our cloud plans are all managed servers. So if you're going to compare our plans to other providers for Zojo Cloud, you need to compare them to a managed service, not just any old server. For example, if you go to AWS or Rackspace or certain places like that, DigitalOcean, and you get a server, that's just an empty server that they do nothing with. It's up to you to configure it, to install it, to keep it updated for security. You're going to manage that server entirely on your own. We do the management for you with Zojo Cloud. So one of the things you want to look at is the price difference between a regular cloud server and a Zojo Cloud server. What is your time worth? Right? We all sell our time. So what's your time worth? And my guess is you're going to find that the extra cost of a Zojo Cloud server is well worth it because of the amount of management that we're doing. And the way that we can do that management efficiently and make it honestly cost effective is because every Zojo Cloud server is configured the same way. Edward had a question. If deploying in Zojo Cloud, can MBS plugins or others be used as a solution? They can be. You just have to make sure that the plugin supports Linux, because your app is going to be compiled for Linux. It's going to be running on a Linux OS. So as long as the plugin supports Linux, you should be able to use it. Eric is asking, for the parameterized queries, are the placeholders position? Can you use named parameters? No, you cannot use named parameters. You just have to put them in the right order as your symbols, your placeholders appear. Okay, Edward asked about external plugins. You can use plugins, so I think I already answered that question above. So Just is asking, I might have missed, but I wonder how to detect if the user is on a computer or a mobile browser in order to provide a sufficient layout. I don't actually remember how you do that. Ricardo?
Yeah, you can be checking the session width and height, and from that you will be able to know if it's a mobile or not.
Right, and that's actually probably the best way to do it, because ultimately what you care about is what layout do I show based on the size that I have that's being given to me, right? So that's good. Hano is asking, is deploying of an app always the complete app, or are there parts of the app? No, when you deploy it, it deploys the entire app, soup to nuts, the whole thing. I believe we do have some incremental options, though. Ricardo, is that correct? I think when you deploy to Zojo Cloud, it only sends up what has changed. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think it actually does some optimizations to only
Yeah.
send parts of it, but yeah.
Yeah, but what ends up on the server is the whole app.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Bob Grove is asking, you mentioned boot swatch compatibility. What about Postgres and MySQL current release compatibility? I believe we tend to keep the Postgres and MySQL versions up to the most stable release. We don't update them for every single release right when it comes out. But you can, because we want those to be ones we can really count on. But they're fairly recent releases. Tim is asking, where can I find documentation on what server-side actions should take place and what client-side actions should be? Basically, Tim, everything happens on the server. The user might be typing on, or clicking on the browser, but there's really no code that is executing client-side, except for when the layout's being delivered to construct the actual page that gets displayed. Everything else is on the server. Okay, someone who prefers to be anonymous apparently asked, do you have physical access to your cloud infrastructure or do you use cloud services like AWS, Azure, etc.? I think the question is, where does Zojo Cloud live? Zojo Cloud lives on DigitalOcean, but interestingly enough, it didn't always live on DigitalOcean. So the way you access, as the Zojo user developer, the way you access Zojo Cloud is completely irrelevant. Which servers we use for our backend is irrelevant to you, because the way you're going to access them is going to be the same no matter where our servers are. Okay, Sebastian's asking, thank you for your answers. I want to ask if there's a way to scroll through a web dialog when the web browser is smaller than the dialog size. I believe that that's automatic, but I think you have to use a container control. Ricardo?
Yeah, if you use a container, for example, you can create a container that is really high, and you can enable the scroll there. So the user can see a really small web dialog while he's still able to scroll.
Okay, great. Yeah, I know I've seen that. I didn't remember if that was through a web container or not. Okay, Dewey is asking, is there any chance Zojo will be adding an option to generate a PWA? And I'm going to show my ignorance because I don't recognize that acronym. Ricardo, do you know what that is?
Yeah, it's the progressive web app. At the moment, no, we are not planning to add them.
Okay. All right, Nick is asking, if I put the app on Zojo Cloud and the database is on another server, do I have to worry about security of the databases apart from checking input data? Well, this is why we suggest, I mean, if it's all on the Zojo Cloud server, then no, as long as you do things like, using prepared statements and such, you shouldn't have to worry about it. But that server is accessible to the internet by definition because your app has to be. So if you're concerned about your database, we recommend that the database go on a separate Zojo Cloud server, and we create a secure tunnel between the two so that the server that the database is on is only accessible to the server that is deploying your app and is not generally accessible to the internet itself. So that's the purpose of that. Clemens is asking, are there fixed maintenance periods in Zojo Cloud where my app would not be accessible? There are, but they're extremely minor. We tend to pick a time when most servers are not in use, and they're very, very quick. Your app really wouldn't be inaccessible. When we do need to do maintenance that would make your app inaccessible, we will tell you that way in advance so that you can plan for it, but that's pretty rare. Edward's asking if a user copies and pastes from Microsoft Word or other applications into a web text area, are there reasons for the text to be incorrectly processed when captured to a variable? Could the encoding be incorrect? Could illegal characters get through? I guess I know what you're saying there. Ricardo, what do you think?
I don't really know. Yeah, I will probably have to test that. Yeah, if you really want to escape everything, yeah, you will have to escape it in the server side probably. But yeah, I do think that the web text area is going to filter out the invalid characters.
Yeah, it's not going to do it
Probably.
for you, basically, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Juice is asking, how do I put resource files on Zojo Cloud? Just adding them to the project or uploading them separately? You can actually do both. The easiest thing is just to add them to your project. But I believe there's a way to access the server and there's like a documents directory and things like that. Do you have anything to add there, Ricardo?
Yeah, probably if you really want to use FTP, I think you can just upload them. But yeah, if I I think it's the better way is to just use the build a step to copy the resources into the resource folder.
Right.
Like, yeah, just like in the desktop application.
Right. You can use Zojo script, basically, right? You use an application script, rather.
Yeah, you will use a copy build a step into the
copy.
resource folder. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Okay, we've only got time for a few more questions, so I'm going to get to those here. Tim is asking, I assume there's no limit to the number of separate apps you can upload to Zojo Cloud, so long as the cumulative resources used by the apps don't go over the limits of the cloud plan. That's correct. We don't in any way limit how many apps you run. We leave that purely up to you to decide whether or not your server can handle more apps or not. Fernando's asking, in terms of resource consumption per session, when we compile an application in an independent, the application will consume memory in just the session variables for each user, so I think the question he's asking is, as you have more users, does the application itself use more resources? I don't believe so, other than what the user, but just the fact that you have more sessions. Ricardo, is there anything else that would be increased?
Yeah, well, every session is going to increase the memory usage because we have to take care of the current status of every control in every session. So
Right.
So yes, yeah.
Okay, but there's most of the application itself is going to only be in memory once, right? It's not like duplicating. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Bill's asking, is there a possibility that Zojo will allow control level CSS? And if so, when? I think we do give you access to some CSS now. Isn't that right, Ricardo?
Yeah, you can use the style property of any web control, and you can add CSS values there. But I think there is a feature request also to add a class name to individual controls. So it's more comfortable if you really want to use your custom CSS. So right. Yeah, there is a feature request already.
Okay. And we're interested in that. So I'm sure something like that will come along at some point. Okay, Edward's asking, are there mechanisms with Zojo to get a feel for current performance? I'm not sure what you're asking there. The best thing you can do is put your app on a server and start testing it, because performance is so specific to what your app is doing. It's really, every app is different. So a very light data entry app that's just a bunch of fields, adding records to a database, you're going to get a lot of users on one server or one instance. But if it's something doing a lot of intense database searches and calculations and churning through a lot of data, maybe you're uploading files and processing them, that's going to obviously use up a lot of CPU and memory, and that's going to mean fewer users per instance. Edwin is asking, so plugins are possible as long as they're Linux. Does the type of Linux distribution matter? I don't believe so. Plugins don't tend to be specific to a distribution, but of course, if they are, you would need to check with the plugin author on that. Okay, Juiced is asking, can I watch this webinar again later? Yes, we're going to put this webinar up on YouTube as we do all of our webinars. That'll go up very, very soon, so you'll be able to watch it again. And of course, pass it along to other people who didn't get a chance to see it. And looks like last but not least, Edward's asking, how much memory do apps use? I know it can be monitored in Windows, but within Zojo. Well, at least on Zojo Cloud, we provide the statistics window. Actually, it's right in the Zojo IDE when you have a Zojo Cloud server, and you can see over time. It's actually a scrolling animated graph that shows you memory usage. I think it shows disk usage as well, and CPU usage. So you can monitor it, and then you can determine, hey, if you're using a lot of resources and people are complaining that the app is getting sluggish, you probably have a pretty good clue about what's going on. But on the other hand, if they're saying it's sluggish and your resources, from the statistics window look fine, well, then it's something maybe with the application logic you have to look at. Okay, but I don't believe there's anything built into the framework itself. I mean, Ricardo, is there anything that someone could use framework side?
No, you will have to monitor the process like any other process.
Okay. Okay, we're reaching the end. I really appreciate everybody coming and all your great questions. I hope you found the webinar valuable. And if you do, be sure to send us feedback and let us know what you thought of it. And we will see you at the next webinar. We'll have one coming up next month on deploying or building rather mobile apps. So until next time, bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.